Located in the southernmost part of Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar, the Kutupalong refugee camp is the world's largest refugee camp, with a population of around 600,000, mostly comprising of the Rohingya refugees who migrated from Myanmar to avoid religious persecution. Today, we speak to John Wagner and Nadyeli Quiroz, recent graduates of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, who first became involved in the Kutupalong refugee camp as a part of an option studio led by prominent architect Anna Heringer. They continued their engagement in the camp even after their studio ended, marking the beginning of a research project that critically looks at spaces of migration as well as a practice that promotes a new kind of design advocacy. My name is Vaishnavi Shukla and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight unconventional design practices and research projects that reflect the emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture Off Center features conversations with some exceptionally creative individuals who have extrapolated the traditional fields of architecture, planning, landscape, and urban design. John and Nadyeli, I'm so excited to have you both here on the inaugural episode of Architecture Off Center. So thank you so much for being here. I wanted to get us started with literally asking the most basic question. How did the two of you end up in the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh?
Okay, so thank you, Vaishnavi, so much for having us here. We are very honored to be here with you in this first episode. So I can get started with this question. And we met in grad school in the hallways of school, and then we ended up in the same optional studio, which was a studio led by Anna Heringer. And the studio was exploring how architecture, and particularly modern architecture, could be integrated into the design of community facilities in the Rohingya refugee camp. And it was by Anna's introduction that we traveled to the refugee camp the first time. And then this just created much more inquiries and questions on us. And we start talking a lot about the problem and how actually design could be of use in this type of crisis. And that's how we continue further with this research.
So for anybody who's not roamed the streets of the refugee camp, what was it like going from this extremely clean and sanitized place that is Cambridge and just being in the middle of what started as a temporary settlement and now is on its way to becoming a permanent city of sorts? Walk us through what it was like when you showed up in Bangladesh. What was it like?
Well, so when we first arrived in Bangladesh, I think our best introduction to that experience was driving about 2 kilometers the wrong way on the interstate or the highway from the airport to our hotel, which gave all of our jet-lagged, exhausted hearts an enormous shock. And kind of the transition from GSD to visit a country like Bangladesh was absolutely extraordinary. It was extraordinary, particularly, I think, for me and some of my colleagues who had not yet been to a developing country, because it was truly an immersive exposure to the kind of the reality of the world that you may have before only had seen in photographs or in documentaries. And I think that reality was compounded by when we first stepped foot out of the van in the Rohingya refugee camp. And after driving for about an hour on bumpy, windy roads through the hinterlands of the Chittagong foothills, we came into the refugee camp after seeing like this vast horizon of deforestation and kind of descending into this valley in this dusted plain. You could just see, in like the sun-beaten ground, you could just see the absolute baked landscape of where there used to be a forest, or there used to be this very verdant, very moist forest. It was now just like this dry and desolate place at the time that we visited the camp. And though it's since regenerated and become like kind of much more forested and much more reflecting what the natural condition of the site was before the influx. What was so shocking to see as we walked through the camp was how unforeign and unexotic and how real it all was. From the white paint of the UN vehicles like barreling down the brick road to the dusty chalk on the children's hands that were playing in the gutter, to the texture of the tarpaulins that are the very same that, a million miles away in my youth in the United States would be what we would tie around a boat after we're storing it for the season. Like the very same materials, this very same substance, and it was so real. And for me, particularly, it just really evaporated the distance between a clean, sterile place like GSD and something foreign and supposedly exotic like the Rohingya camp. It suddenly became as immediate and as present and as real as any of the things that were at our fingertips within the clean halls of Gund Hall.
Yes, I will also add that what was really interesting, I think, it's the expectations you have beforehand going to a refugee camp. And I think that was my first time in one, and is the only one I've visited so far. And I didn't know it is such a normalized thing, and it has been such a normalized thing in humanity since World War II. I had no idea about that. But when I visited, I was expecting it to be completely bounded and isolated from the actual fabric of Bangladesh. And we came to realize it's not. Like the site is so big that it cannot be
contained,
fenced.
Got it.
Yes, it cannot be fenced. So there are some doors and controls, but then there are parts that are completely open, and they are served by many of the facilities or services that are given at the camp. And this for me was a big shock to see that it's not an isolated settlement, but it sort of starts to be integrated into the country. And also it's just readily at hand. Like the first time we visited with the GSD, we were staying at a hotel, and it was just a touristic hotel in front of the beach, like for Europeans and Americans. And then just like a bus ride, we were in a refugee camp. It's just like it was right there. It's these two realities so close to each other and ignoring each other.
What was it that you were designing? What was the project brief for the studio like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we were tasked to design was a daycare for Rohingya refugee children.
Got it.
And the scope was to make this out of earth. So each of our studio projects explored different ways of applying earth and mud to design buildings.
It's interesting because we're getting to the juice of what today's conversation is about. And John, you mentioned seeing these white UN vans around the settlement when you got there. So this was particularly an interesting case because you guys worked on this project as a part of the Option Studio, and it evolved into a much larger, longer project where you took the initiative to stay engaged with the community, with the organizations working on ground, and continue your research. I assume that's a lot of the work you did initially just focus on building trust and building coalitions. And so what was it like being on ground, working with all these different agencies? So what was your process like? So once the studio ended, what began?
I think that, the proximity with which Nadyeli describes, this juxtaposition between like the touristic hotel and the refugee crisis just over the ridge it's very interesting, the distance between, or the proximity between the reality and then the distance between us and getting back to that place. And I think what we undertook after the studio was what turned into a multi-year process to try to find meaningful re-engagement with the situation in a way that our skill sets as designers, so we thought, could be contributive. In the spirit of what the studio was, but also more broadly in kind of the vein of the kind of practice that we wish to engage in, which is consequential, meaningful kind of design activism. So after the studio, what we undertook was a variety of different engagements to both create a kind of create a mission or create a meeting to go back, and that was in partnership with the nonprofit organization that had hosted our first trip as the Options Studio, and meeting with their directors and some of their staff agents. They kind of created a pathway for us to then have a purposefulness in finding grant funding and finding scholastic support and finding a kind of a pathway for us to return. All of that took quite a while. And along the way, we found other avenues to explore the project and develop the project that gave us kind of a product of our effort before we went there. One of which is the installation that you might describe, Nadyeli, that we made the spring after the Option Studio in Harvard Yard.
Yes, I mean, that installation is one of the works we did, which was creating just like an art installation in the Harvard Yard space out of bamboo, describing what the situation is like and using the basic materials that were used for creating the refugee camp, with its bamboo and tarpaulin and rope also. So that is one of the efforts we did that help us like raise the awareness and also have people engaging in the process we were pursuing. Because I think like when we were working on the studio, and as John just mentioned, like the studio had a very architectural prompt, and I mean, we were in an architecture studio. But as we were designing our projects for the studio, John and I were also all the time having like conversations till late night in studio, asking like, is this really it? Like, is this really what a humanitarian crisis of such a scale needs? Is it just simply form, capital A architecture materials? Like, what is it that design can bring to the conversation? And we started like researching, and also from other professors in school being interested in art processes and community engagement to address these problems, and to think of a different way of practice that is just not about form. And I think the installation was a pretty important way for us to bring attention to other ways of doing things and other ways of engaging, and that probably we were onto something, and it was worth it helping us go back there.
When I look at that installation that you guys did, it was also just the way it was located, almost on this very pious cardinal axis of the Harvard Yard between the church and the library, and creating this walkway, creating this space in between that almost talks about the politics of visibility and the fact that architecture at some times doesn't always need to build in order to achieve the goal, but a role of an architect and us as designers can also to make visible something that's not as visible in our day-to-day life, right? So you're trying to highlight something or put across a situation that exists in another part of the world, but that is so important and so essential to us knowing the different ways in which we can drive a change. And there's two things I want to get into based on what Nadyeli is just talking about. But I've been thinking about the agency of us designers, and as in my own immediate surrounding, and more so in the context that you guys are working with, and you've been highlighting the importance of collective designing and a participatory design process in sites like the refugee camp. You very briefly mentioned in our previous meeting about collaborating with other architects. So you're talking about co-create, and you're talking about CAN. Super interesting how that coalition was built, and how you ended up kind of creating a whole different mode of practice, so to say, in the refugee camp. Very interesting. Can you talk about both the participatory design process and the participatory architectural practice that emerged in this site?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the themes that kind of underscores what Nadyeli's describing in this installation we made in Harvard Yard, and the coalition that we necessarily had to begin to form to have an effective or useful contribution back in the camp, has to do with the role of communication in design. And so before I speak specifically to the coalition of CAN and of Co-Create Architects and of Fatmi Khwaja and Rizvi Hassan and Asad Mustafa, to name a few. I think that the role of communication takes so many forms in this work that's really important, I think, for how we've begun to understand the broader implications of this work in our own collaboration and ongoing practice.
Mm.
And that is, how could design communicate between worlds, to use your phrase? And in Harvard Yard specifically, the axis and the positioning of the installation was so intentional, because what we were trying to communicate was that the occupation of space is the first act. It's maybe the most dramatic act of politics. It's the most dramatic act of speech, is because before you even say something, you have to be there.
Mm.
And so by putting this installation in Harvard Yard, we were trying to share with the community that, like, there was this ongoing crisis, this genocide occurring on the other side of the world, but the ability to intervene, or the ability to make positive intervention, need not be so complicated, need not be so technological, need not be so high intense, high resource, high capital. That the simple act of creating space through a sunshade is maybe one of the first steps of solidarity, one of the first steps of resistance to an impossible situation. And so it was through that communication that we were able to even be funded and get the momentum to be able to return to Bangladesh, to follow through on the communications that we had made with these coalitions that you've enumerated. To describe that aspect of the work, once we had received an opportunity to return to Bangladesh, in part through both Nadyeli's thesis and my fellowship, the Irving Innovation Fellowship at Harvard Graduate School of Design, as well as underwriting from the Laboratory for Design Research, Urban Stack, we were able to, through those grants, return to Bangladesh a year after our first visit, to meet face-to-face and to actually be introduced to new activists and architects and planners who are working in that context.
Mm.
And so I guess I've said quite a bit, but the next kind of chapter here is really all of those engagements that we made and what they meant, and the kind of work that we learned of and were inspired by in Bangladesh.
Yeah, it was really interesting how those relationships got shaped, because we had different introductions, some from faculty or visiting scholars that were giving lectures at the GSD. We talked to them, they gave us names, and we just wrote to everyone. We also saw some of the work of the architects that they were doing on the camp, and we reached out through their LinkedIn. But what was really special is that through all of these connections we made with many architects in Bangladesh, everyone was pointing us to talk to Co-Create.
Mm.
Since we arrived in Bangladesh, everyone was like, yeah, you should really meet the two architects in the office of Co-Create. You should really meet them, but they were not in our itinerary, because they were living not close to the refugee camp, not close to Dhaka. They were like in a completely different region that we never planned to visit. But then we went to the camp, and there we were hosted by BRAC NGO.
Mm.
And we were directly working with the architects that work for BRAC, which was also an initiative that was very innovative from BRAC to hire architects, because usually the construction is solved by engineers. And in this case, BRAC introduced the work of architects, and these were very young architects that John just mentioned, Rizvi, Sad, Fatmi. They were very young architects. We became very good friends, and they were all, they have been students of Co-Create architects before. So they were the one really carrying this idea of collaborating with the craftsmen, collaborating with the people, engaging the local knowledge of construction. And they were really the ones carrying this agenda into the refugee camp. And they did this through the space that BRAC opened for them to explore and to work in this direction.
Hope you're enjoying this conversation with John and Nadyeli. While we take a short break, I wanted to share a snippet from our next episode with Raji Desai, where she's talking about all kinds of stuff in the outer space, from death of satellites to the politics of space waste management.
And then we're looking at the space cemetery, which is like this remote, desolate site located in the depths of the South Pacific Ocean where no human being has been. So it's kind of these two extreme or limit conditions or new frontiers of waste, as I call them.
I hope you tune back in 2 weeks to know more about the extraorbital infrastructures. Now, back to John and Nadyeli.
So we've spoken a fair bit about working on ground and about practice. I'm gonna step back a little bit and look at it from a more theoretical, abstract perspective, and what the essence of both your works and your work together focuses on migration and space, right? It's questions about migration and space as in the space that has been occupied and laid claim on by these refugees, but also the space that you're trying to create through design. Well, not necessarily space as in like the build space, but the space of collaboration and the space of, as John said, solidarity and resistance, right? So in that sense, I want to bring into focus, John, you at some point invoked the Arte Util Manifesto, which advocates that architecture should raise awareness and be useful. And Nadyeli, in your MDes thesis, you're talking about the permanence of the temporal and the artifacts of freedom in the camp. So from a theoretical perspective, when you're dealing with a site that's has so many layers and that's emerged out of a certain crisis, and that is not something that you can, well, to say homogeneous is being stupid, but has so many different facets to it, right? Be it economical, political, spatial, environmental. In the beginning, you talked about entering this huge settlement that was a result of immense deforestation, right? So it's environmental as well. And I want to put it in a certain framework or use these lenses to look at it from a theoretical perspective. I'd love to hear from John, you to begin with, about how you think that architecture should advocate and should raise awareness and be useful. Are we talking about a new kind of architecture that goes beyond its boisterous forms and that has at its center a different kind of intention? Is that what we're getting at?
Yeah, I think that intention is it's some. I don't have the exact word to articulate, but it's a bit more subdued, right, than an architecture that's triumphant, that's in your face, that's very flashy. I think one of the most non-theoretical aspects of working as the way these practitioners in the camp are working for BRAC is that they're resonating on a very human level with the clients that they serve, which are ostensibly the refugees, but specifically the NGOs that are underwriting the construction of these buildings. And the way that they resonate with these communities is, it's going to sound very almost trite, but like by listening to what people need, and not in a superficial way, in a way that's very humble. So, for example, a material palette that reflects the environments that people are familiar with from where they've been, using bamboo, weaving textiles, arranging pergolas and outdoor spaces in a meaningful way so that there's kind of these antechambers to the actual program of the NGO's clinic or school or space. These are very, very meaningful design attributes that go a very long way in making the spaces much more humane, much more dignified. Mm-hmm. For people who have been stripped of all dignity and even relegated to inhumanity. I mean, you can't solve a geopolitical crisis with architecture. But that's not to say you can't give respect to the people who are completely marginalized by powers beyond their control. And the difference here is between the difference between a prefabricated metal imported structure that's very hot and sweltering and inappropriate for this climate, and a breathing, airy, comfortable building that's responsive to the climate and also aesthetically reflecting the material palette and also the practical accessibility of the materials that are local to that region. These very subtle differences are almost maybe like, let's say, low threshold differences begin to, I think, illustrate what that collaborative design or that kind of communication of design these architects are exhibiting. They're resonating with a place, they're resonating with the people, they're resonating with the community in a way that I think capital A architecture, or proper architecture, has so many degrees of separation from.
Right.
And so that juxtaposition that I'll keep going back to, that Nadyeli mentioned about the luxury Western-oriented hotel, just a few kilometers from the refugee camp, that proximity then begins to become completely divergent, right? Because the worlds are just so enormously divergent that the regulatory, procedural kind of professionalization of our own world that we're trained within all but evaporates on the ground when you realize that everything's in negotiation in the heat of the moment. You're talking with the craftsman. That's the materials. This is the site. Oh, wait, we don't have the site today. We have to move the site over there. We have to design this on the back of a napkin because we have to build it tomorrow. Like, it's just a totally fluid kind of like completely reconfiguring in every single hour situation that makes the paradigm of process and the paradigm of regulation and the paradigm of prefabrication or prototyping in a way that's more industrialized, poorly suited and poorly adaptable to such a fluid context. And that communication, I think, is one that recognizes and respects those conditions and helps to design or apply design, as these architects have been doing, in a way that's contributive to the dignity of the people who use the spaces and to use the buildings that are provided in the camp by the NGOs.
And I think adding to that point that John is making is like all the materials and the tradition, the building traditions that the people already know and are familiar with. It's not only on the scale of architecture that is important, but think that 1 million refugees are being housed, quote unquote, because they are not actually being given houses, they are being given shelters, but 1 million refugees are being housed on temporal shelters that are made out of materials that are only going to become trash. So all the money that is poured into the site to house this 1 million people with plastic materials that then are just going to stay there. And the fact that these architects are introducing much more like bamboo and the traditional materials, it's a completely different situation. Like, you're putting the money not in this plastic that is going to become trash. You're putting the money in the labor, which is, yes, it's more labor intensive. It takes longer. It's a messier process. It's not as clean, as fast as industrialized processes. But the money is not poured on industrialized material, but into the people that is actually building. It goes way beyond architecture.
Yeah, it goes way beyond architecture, and it's definitely an architecture of impermanence. At the forefront of it is like hyper disposability. One thing that we recognize that I think just so perfectly illustrates this notion is the characteristic of Bangla men and how they treat litter. Mm-hmm. When they're making a cigarette or when they're having a snack, you can watch their fingers as they're manipulating whatever packaging it is that is going to be their snack as they're hanging out at the tea stalls, and they just fluttering out of their fingers goes the wrapper, as though it wasn't even there. They just simply drop it to the ground, and it implies a time in not too recent distant past when everything was packaged in leaves. Something that's compostable that would just disappear. There wouldn't be this accumulation of the traces of occupancy that had been there. So when Nadyeli says that it becomes trash, what we're really saying is that an architecture that tries to engineer a permanent resistance to the condition, like a perfectly weatherproof, perfectly resilient, perfectly durable, ideal solution, it really betrays the reality that that's only a a hopeful expectation. And that if you design in a way that anticipates reuse, anticipates recycling, anticipates maintenance, it's such a more genuine, and not in a trite use of the word genuine. I mean, it's more real, it's more practical, it's more sensible. And also it's about 1 million people who have been curtailed any economic or any vocational or any sort of meaningful livelihood. To design in a way that anticipates maintenance and the application of craft labor, I think is a very reasonable alternative, because it gives people a meaningful output for their time and for their arrested development, that they're contained in literally a camp. Like it's a discernible place where they're confined. So there's this kind of revisioning of architecture at play, I think, in what we're trying to describe, and what some of these practitioners have really exemplified in their work. That's an architecture that's like more of a ship of Theseus than an enduring edifice.
Right.
And what is very interesting about John mentioning that in this arrested development, people is going, like, if you give them the possibility of create and do and craft, but saying this is not only like our idea, this is already happening. And this is what I was referring to on my thesis as the artifacts of freedom. They are already doing this. Like, the fact of a refugee camp is basically telling the refugees, now you have to wait here, we are going to house you, we are going to give you food, we are going to give you basic healthcare, and you don't have to do anything, you just wait till we resettle you wherever,
right,
until conflict subsides. And I mean, that could make sense for a couple of weeks, but we're talking about years with still no resolution of what is going to happen. You cannot, like, people is not going to stay there just waiting with these very, very basic services. So actually people reclaim agency, and they start rebuilding, and they start creating, and they even decorate. It's not like it, even aesthetics appear as an important part of survival.
There's so many things that I think I could build on, Nadyeli, based off what you said. It's almost like this place is not here or there. It's not temporary, but it's not permanent, because it's been there. And I think time plays such an important role. If you think of the refugee camp as an informal settlement of sorts, you see over time also a shift in the use of materials. So from using the materials that are tarpaulin and that are bamboo, it's a matter of time before that also starts gaining a certain permanence of sorts in terms of the materials that you start using. As over time, people find a sense of belonging, maybe not in the most positive way, but simply due to a matter of time that they've been there. It's a certain connection you have with the place, and you start laying claim by building more pakka houses. So you start seeing those temporary materials being replaced, and you start maybe over time seeing brick walls with a tin roof, and then maybe that being replaced by a concrete slab. And then this architecture of impermanence also becomes a very permanent thing, that because of forces that are beyond the control of architecture made people call this their home in one way or another. And I mean, globally speaking, we've seen refugee camps being abandoned and becoming ghost towns, but you've also seen refugee camps become full-fledged cities, right? So
yes,
in my perspective, it's all these factors that are not in our control that, combined with the question of time, keeps adding these layers that make it more complicated. And then, I mean, of course, family life goes on, people procreate, and you have another generation that's born into the camp. And for that generation that has not seen the migration, this is what home means. And that's where people grow up, and that's what the life is for them. As a human race, we have witnessed more humanitarian crises and cases of mass migration in the last 2 decades than we have ever before, be it the Syrian refugee crisis or the one in Ecuador, or even the climate migration that's happening around the world. And we as designers have also found opportunities in terms of these crises and used our training to make lives better, whether it is for the short term, if not for the long haul. So keep it in mind, I guess, young architects and graduates like you who are interested in pursuing a practice with a certain social agenda. How does one engage with an area of conflict? And I want to push this a little further and know, what other forms of design advocacy has it evolved into for both of you? Opening it up, but what are your thoughts?
Yes, that's an excellent question. How can you engage in situations with the skill sets of design? I think what's been so helpful for us is this philosophy you mentioned in Tanya Bruguera's Art Utile. And in her thesis on Art Utile, it's this provocation that art should be useful. It should have social utility. It should have practical utility. It should be consequential beyond the aesthetic or kind of appreciation of the art as a conceptual work. And I think that idea of utility is really what's key. That we're a young designer such as ourselves, compelled to intervene or compelled to find positive contribution to a crisis situation, like the migration crisis on the southern border of the United States, for example, or on the southern border of Mexico, for that matter, or enormous influxes of and movements of people in South America because of climate and political instability. I think that what's most important in engaging those situations is to find a way to be useful without a preconception of what that usefulness might take the form of.
That is so important. Yes. Without that preconception of what that usefulness is. I'm just going to add one more thing. I think this resonates with me so much because by saying that, you're also saying that if we as architects are engaging with these environments, it should be without the preconception of knowing, or with that uncertainty of knowing that the way you are offering yourself or the way you're being useful is not necessary by building something. And I think that is something we often take it for granted that we as architects always build something, but it doesn't always have to deal with the physical act of building. Like that building could take a lot of different forms.
Yes, it's absolutely spot on. That building can take the form of advocacy. It can take the form of coalition building. It can take the form of public awareness. It could take the form of simply creating the conditions to create. And I think that's really the key role that designers have an insight into, is that because design, as it is trained and as it is understood, conceives of a world that could be, what we really need to be focusing on is, well, what preconditions are necessary to engender the momentum of building towards that world. It's not just the render, which is very effective to inspire people's imaginations. And I think a lot of successful practices rely on imagery to forward their brand much more so than written word. I mean, in the contemporary time, written theory is not nearly as important to the forwarding of the discipline of architecture as it had been in previous eras. But the visual image is extremely powerful. But I think we're at a moment in recent history, especially the last few months under the pandemic lockdown in not just the United States, but more broadly, social currents have really shown that we're in a moment where the preconditions for change are as important as the goal or the mission of the change itself. Because even with the idea that you can design an alternative future, it's so important that you have the conditions that enable that momentum to be built in the first place. So to put a really clear point on what I'm saying, designers must design the conditions that enable things to be created. That's what we have to focus our design on, creating the conditions where we can create.
And I would like to follow on the idea of designers are not only designing buildings, and how we approach the refugee camp and how our relationship to this research has evolved. Because I think we were first approaching it as professional architects that build things. And when we were there the second time, it was more of a learning lesson than bringing something. Like we learned from these architects, the Community Architects Network of South Asia, Co-Create Architects, and our friends in BRAC. We learned so much of how to actually be architects in a different way, to approach people and to approach a space, and to be an activist and to make another type of change. That I think now we are thinking of this topic of migration as a crisis that is just getting worse, and it's gonna be even more acute with climate change and with all the political and economical problems that now are just been heightened also by the virus. So thinking that there is a much more difficult migration crisis to come, and that we have to start engaging. There are very few designers in the humanitarian space working. It's not common. Building, it's taken mostly by engineers, and we do have to engage this. And now we see what we learn as something that can help us to thinking of the practice of the people and the problem in Bangladesh, and all the positive things that have, like all the good work that has been done in that camp, despite also all the problems that every refugee camp has and all the things that have not been addressed. But there are many good lessons that we want to look at that as things that can be learned for other regions. How can we incorporate this learning into probably, which is our region, the Americas, and this side of the world?
Well said, Nadyeli. Very well said. Now, I know you've both been collaborating, researching, and working on this project for about 2 years. And I also know that there's a book in the pipeline. So how's that going, and what's next for both of you?
Yes, so the book that we're really excited to put together is an invitation among different scholars and practitioners and activists on the topic of the spaces of migration. Because what really stems from our work in the Rohingya refugee camp and expands more broadly into the practice that we might be doing or are engaging in this hemisphere has to do with these marginal spaces between the host and the refugee community. And so that work began actually as a conference proposal for the graduate school of design, which, because of the extenuating circumstances of the pandemic, was the conference that was not to be. But
in all honesty, that brief was super, super interesting. Like, it was super interesting. So I wish you guys pick it up and, I don't know, just do it outside of the institution whenever, but please do it.
Yeah, that's really encouraging for you to say that, because that's really like the template, or like, let's say the framework of how we're conceiving of what the book might be, which would be a collection of viewpoints and essays by scholars and practitioners and providers who are already working with these communities to think about the idea or the issue of migration specifically around space, because it's about land and territory and space that one group is excluded or forced from or pulled out of one place and is introduced into another. And so the implications for this in terms of urbanism and settlement and landscape and territory are multifold, and I think a very important lens that we're really interested to speak of within our disciplinary stack of design more broadly. I think that work is going to be an encouraging kind of project for 2021 as we kind of get our footing in this COVID world. For the upcoming year, that'll be the bulk of our project and efforts.
Yeah, and I think that also that you mentioned about the brief of the conference, we are really thinking of re-engaging with all of the scholars that we were talking to, and actually bringing this back as a conversation now. Maybe that we are so used to Zoom, maybe it'll be around Zoom next semester. Like, this is just like a conversation that we've been having backstage, and you're the first person that we mentioned it to.
Now, the power of the spoken word, this is going to be held in evidence, and maybe this will push you to actually do it because you're saying it out loud.
Absolutely. Yeah, it'll be so complementary to our invitations and correspondence with different contributors to the publication to also have that corollary conversation. I think will be really helpful and a great way to build momentum around the topic.
On the note of building scholarship, John and Nadyeli, thank you so much for this very exciting, enriching conversation and for being on the first episode. I can't wait to see what you guys do, and I hope I get a signed copy of the book whenever it comes out.
Oh, thank you so much for having us.
Of course you will. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. It is great to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Special thanks to Kahan Shah for the background score. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Architecture Off Center on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes are released every 2 weeks. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Arc of Center. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. Thank you for listening.